So the culture historians were very descriptive in nature, and Boas and his students produced a number of ethnographies, and these are simply descriptions of cultures. Very detailed works, you can still read them today, but these were used then to help establish chronological sequences both locally and kind of regionally. Culture history also developed classification, and this is actually some of the methods are still being used today. Now, classification, you have to understand, is highly subjective. I don't care what field you're in, classification is artificial. But we use this to help examine relationships among sites. But again, highly subjective, usually based on the number of similar attributes. So classification schemes could have been based on pottery, could have been based on projectile points, those types of things. Now, one of the things that culture history is predicated upon is this idea of a normative view of culture. And there's this assumption that there are kind of abstract rules that govern normal human behavior. But, what is normal? And, since this time frame, we've really figured out that normal is in it of itself culturally determined. There's also this assumption that the artifacts display stylistic changes and other types of changes that represent changing norms within any given society. Most archaeologists still employ this to some extent, and particularly the chronology part of it and the classification part of it, because it does help us to establish basic time and space. And this was the major goal of the culture historians: establish chronological sequence, and that's actually really important. But it doesn't answer any questions about human behavior. Now, one of the major proponents was Alfred Kidder, who was an archaeologist, and he's considered the father of anthropological archaeology. So he did say archaeology needs to address questions about human behavior, but he himself never really got around to doing it. He is responsible for developing a typology of ceramics from the American Southwest, still being used today. The next paradigm I want to talk about is cultural ecology or culture ecology, and this simply says that culture change is in response to environmental pressures. So the main proponents here are Julian Stewart and Leslie White. Stewart came up with this idea that similar human adaptations in widely separated cultures were because they were in similar environments. He also believed that changes would first come up in what he called the culture core. And the cultural core are the set of adaptive tools that allow humans to adapt to their environment. So if there were going to be changes in the environment, then the cultural changes would show up there first in that culture core. White kind of developed a kind of picturesque model of this, where this cake in the bottom corner is kind of representative. So if the base is environment, that biggest tier would be the culture core, as the material tools and so forth that humans use to interact with their environment. So if we see changes in the environment, then we're going to see changes in those tools. That's going to lead to social changes, which could then lead to changes in ideology. And probably one of the best examples of this would be the change to agriculture. So like one theory proposes that things got really dry and people began growing crops to make sure they had enough food. We're going to talk about these in more detail later, so don't think that that is the theory I support. This is just an easy example. So we have changes in tools for agriculture. Bows and arrows not necessarily as important, but hoes, shovels, things like that. Because now we got rain is so important that maybe, or actually harvesting, I got ahead of myself. You have to plant and harvest and so forth, so we have new social organization. We need larger groups of people. Well, we have larger groups of people, so we need somehow to organize and keep everything in order. So we develop some new ideologies based primarily around maybe like rain gods, because rain becomes important when you're a farmer. So that's basically culture ecology in a nutshell. Part of this also, which Stewart came up with, is this idea of multilinear evolution to help explain the different societies. So if you have hunters and gatherers here, well, that's great because that's an ideal way to capture energy from that environment. You have pastoralists here, well, great, that's was really great adaptation to that environment. Agriculturalists over here, the same kind of thing. So trying to explain why you see hunting and gatherers here, pastoralists here, industrial agriculturalists here, within the context of their environment and capturing energies within an environment. So optimal energy capture. Processualism emerges around the same time that cultural ecology does, but it really doesn't take off until the 1960s when we start to see massive social change in North America. But the two men that are kind of responsible for this are often referred to as archaeology's angry young men, because at the time they were. These pictures show them later on in their career. But the first was W. Taylor, and in 1948 he published his dissertation, which was a study of archaeology, and he just lambasted the culture historians. He said they were doing description for description's sake and weren't explaining anything about culture. And Taylor was concerned with the interconnection of artifacts and their cultural context. So, what can we learn from where we're finding things? What does that say about what was going on? Taylor claimed that we needed to test hypotheses. And, while modern archaeologists would say, yes, he's right, he pretty much killed his career, by really, as I said, lambasting the culture historians. But so he ignites the torch, which is then picked up by Louis Binford in the early 1960s, and starts this kind of revolution in archaeology, often referred to as the new archaeology. So the use of scientific method to explain cultural process. It's problem-oriented archaeology, and it ushered in this era of problem-oriented archaeology. So what we're talking about here is, asking questions about the human and the landscape interaction. So really having a specific question in mind when you go out. It is focused on the material aspects of culture, so it's materialism at its finest. And looking at how those artifacts can explain the interaction, again, of humans with their environment. And that's what's driving the development of a culture. Ideology gets left out of this whole kind of processual approach. So the big contributions of processualism are methodological, and one of them is experimental archaeology. So experimental archaeology simply studies designed to aid archaeologists in the interpretation of the archaeological record by attempting to duplicate behavioral processes. So that's kind of a long definition, but if anybody's ever seen any of the shows on like the History Channel or something about people trying to move large megalithic stones to recreate Stonehenge or the Moai on Easter Island, those are examples of experimental archaeology trying to recreate the process of building Stonehenge or constructing, carving and moving a Moai. People create tools, like make their own stone tools. They dig their own pits to see what kind of natural processes are at work, what kind of little critters might fall in there to help us explain what we're finding in the archaeological record. People have done mummification, and that's examples of experimental archaeology. Again, things to help us try to interpret what we're finding in the archaeological record.